practicing Lacanian analyst.
Is he?
Was, used to be, hope to be.
Lacanian influenced.
Yeah. Okay. I think, oh, you've started the recording, Mike, great. Okay, it's a great pleasure to welcome Peter to our 9th presentation of the Constructivist Meetup series. Peter and I think it was Philip Boxer that introduced us, wasn't it, Peter, that we had an interest in Charles Peirce in common.
Philip introduced me to your work and then I contacted you to open up a conversation, okay. Yes.
So we've been talking every few weeks for about 10 meetings now. Mm-hmm. And I'm still deeply mystified by what Peter says, but that will all be remedied today, I'm sure. Peter is lecturer in international business management. I noticed on your website, actually, Peter, that you trained as a civil engineer, is that right?
Yeah, I spent 10 years as a civil engineer, 10 years as a management consultant, and then
building bridges and
harbours, dams.
Goodness.
Yeah.
So that must obviously be a strong influence on your thinking.
Equips you wonderfully for dealing with Lacan, I'll tell you. But yes, Peter, it does have an influence.
Peter is at the Newcastle University Business School. I did have a little quote that I came across a couple of days ago from Kelly, no less. And I thought I'd throw it in. I doubt if it's of direct relevance, but I just thought it was rather a nice thing. And that is, he says, in the midst of a heated family discussion, our child's temper tantrum is best understood as a form of scientific inquiry, as opposed, he says later, to an eruption of affect. He says, regard the child's temper tantrum, perhaps, as a frantic experimental effort to articulate some urgent question about human relationships, for which no one so far has been willing to give him a candid answer. I thought that was rather nice. I throw it in for a little light-hearted introduction. So, Peter, shall we hand over to you?
Okay, thank you.
You'll talk for half an hour or 40 minutes, and then we'll have breakouts.
Yeah, okay. So I'll just share the screen to get us started. First of all, thanks very much for giving me this opportunity. I do feel, as everyone's been introduced to me as, you know, experts on this and experts on that, and Harry emailed around to say that I was an expert on Merleau-Ponty and Lacan. I really don't feel that I am, but I think that Lacan particularly has something to say to some of the issues that have been floating around in this series, and that Michael pointed us towards right at the start of the series. So this is not going to be a masterclass on Merleau-Ponty and Lacan. In fact, there's just one very brief mention of Lacan at one point. What I really want to do is to try and make the connections to Kelly, and I will openly admit I know very little about Kelly other than what I've picked up from these sessions and a bit of talking to Harry. But I'm really looking forward to your response to what I have to say, because I want to know whether it connects with you, where and how it connects with you. Because one of the challenges, and I suspect it's a challenge that a lot of us in this room all have, is how to get people to attend to some very strange ways of thinking about how the world works and the nature of reality. So this is just repeating what I had originally written for the blurb that Harry wanted when we set up the Constructivist series. And it's really about, if you take a constructivist view, you understand that reality, the reality that we live in, is a construction that's achieved somehow. What is remarkable to my mind is actually how little consideration is given to how the psyche works in thinking about how this construction takes place. And therefore, we need to sort of, I believe we need to start to open up a better understanding of the psyche, and an understanding of the way that the psyche works that is appropriate for thinking about the issues that, for thinking about the challenges we have in the future, and how we need to think about the relationship between the psyche and reality in the future. Now, this is why Michael's introduction was really interesting to me, because effectively what Michael was saying was that we need to move towards thinking, and can you see the pointer here? Thinking about, thanks, what sort of theorizing should we be doing down in this space here? He's sort of pointing towards the way that when you put social constructionism and embodied enactive experience together, that this is the space that that we need to be thinking about if we're going to move forward from some of the sort of rather tediously role-worn debates about relativism, idealism, subjectivism, objectivism, some of the places where social theory has kind of got stuck. And I, to my current background is I work in a business school. My sort of interlocutors, let's say, are organization theorists, and they, far more so than yourselves here, are very reluctant to go anywhere that thinks about the psyche and how the psyche works. But they're very happy to take a social constructionist type of approach, or a postmodern type of approach. I've redone Michael's slide because it was easier for me on PowerPoint. But it seemed to me that with the context of what we're talking about here, we're really thinking about how Kelly relates into this space that I've shaded in orange, which is where Michael was saying we need to be thinking more, developing theory more. And a key thing here is that on the one hand, across the horizontal axis, we need to think about how the collective and how the individual interact, and what's going on in terms of that interaction, and how that relates to the formation of the constructed reality that we find ourselves living in as individuals. And perhaps for this audience, drawing on this coming out of the Kellyan tradition, or how this links into the Kellyan tradition. So what I've circled or squiggled around there in blue is kind of the space that I feel like I'm trying to address with this talk today. But if you think of the three things that are coming together in the arrows that Michael drew, we've got socialization, the formation of identity in relation to socialization and the other. We have Kelly with his personal constructs and his dyadic poles of personal constructs, etc. And then we have coming out of, here the Maturana and Varela, the radical constructivist approach, the significance of embodied action in the world. And that somehow there's some sort of connection that I think Michael was pointing us towards, to say that if you want to move forwards, we need to try and understand how these three things all come together and interact. So what is the relationship between actually developing experience of reality, developing our reality through action in the world, through being bodies that are moving in the world and are sensing, taking on some sort of sensing of the world. And then the formation of these personal constructs, the ways that we see the world and how we shape the ways that we see the world. And then on top of that, the fact that this is developed in a social milieu. We're not doing this as individuals in isolation. And I think that it's putting these together that is kind of what Harry was saying was not Harry, what Michael was saying was, you know, we need to start thinking in that space if you want to move past some of the sort of the dead end avenues that we've arrived at, because people in these different areas are not necessarily understanding how to talk across them. Now, the challenge I have is that I think, for reasons that I'm going to try and explain here, to do that, we need to start with some sort of understanding of the psyche, which is close to a Lacanian one. And Lacan is incredibly difficult to understand. And I think I'm just scratching the surface of it, and I've been scratching at the surface of it, getting a little bit deeper for a good number of years now. But there's still way more that I don't understand. But what Michael is saying here as well is that if we want to make this progress, we need to move away from these abstract, decontextualized sorts of thinking, which are at the top of the graph here, the top of the boxes, and focus much more on the way that the embodied experience gives us the context out of which we construct our reality. And that therefore the relationship between embodiment, the formation of the psyche, identity, etc., in the way that we become socialized is really important. Now, I've drawn on quite a lot here on paper by Warren from 1990 paper, which is Psychoanalysis and Personal Construct Theory and Exploration, which Harry, thank you very much, Harry, put me on to recently to help me to try and get my head around Kelly. And Dorothy Rowe is cited in there. And I found this sort of, the way that Warren was citing was very useful. So the world we create is a world of meaning. Everything we perceive has a meaning, even if the meaning we give something is this thing has no meaning. So there's a very close association here between perception and meaning. Everything we perceive has a meaning implies that if something does not have a meaning, it cannot be perceived. And this is a fundamental shift away from a sort of observing subject looking at an objective world out there, way of looking at the world. What this says is that you cannot perceive something unless it's meaningful. Now, I said I wasn't going to talk about Merleau-Ponty, but I will very briefly. If you follow the trajectory of Merleau-Ponty's thinking, he died in 1961. His work that he was doing literally just in the late 50s and the posthumously published Visible and Invisible book that he wrote actually was critiquing his early work on phenomenology of perception and was saying that he was basically wrong in that work because he started with a consciousness object distinction. And you can't start with that. You have to start with understanding that there is no consciousness or meaning separate from the object. The object and that we perceive and the meanings that we develop co-arise. It's not we put a meaning on an object. We only see and experience an object when it's become meaningful for us. I'm hoping that in this audience, that is something that is, is not too difficult to follow, but I'd value some feedback on that at the end. So the fundamental attribute of human beings is that they create meaning, and therefore we create perception as well. So we create the objects of our perception, okay? And there's this follow-on that's there's no way that we can prove the truth of the meaning that we impose, okay? The capacity to impose meaning on what may be ultimately or forever meaningless is a terrible irony. What I see in here is an understanding of the way that reality works, that reality is imposed onto something or onto a world, a brute world in which there is no meaning and therefore nothing to perceive until we've given it meaning. And that challenge of how we understand the nature of reality is fundamentally different, I think, to most of what's in the top half of that diagram there, in this abstract decontextualized way of understanding the world. Okay. So again, for more on PCP's fundamental postulate, a person's process is psychologically challenged by the ways in which he or she anticipates events. You don't just react in terms of past experience, but you evaluate events or situations in order to predict the future. And so therefore, what you are experiencing as reality is about trying to make sense of the world and how to act in the world. Here is saying making sense of the world in advance, so to speak, of the next event or situation. I think from Lacan, it would shift a little bit differently. What it'd say is we have we are dynamically interacting in the world, and we then draw on the ways that we symbolize that world to, if you like, try and impose sense back onto it to create meaning and perception. So then the question is, how is this happening? Which I think is a fundamental question about how do we start to unpack that box at the bottom of Michael's diagram? How do we start to unpack this orange box at the bottom here? What sort of way of understanding the world do we need to be bringing to bear on it? And one of the influences that Michael is suggesting is Kelly. And I find this quite a telling quote from Kelly, again, taken from Warren. In this new way of thinking about psychology, the PCP way, there is no learning, no motivation, no emotion, no cognition, no stimulus, no response, no ego, no unconscious, no drive, etc. And if you start murmuring such words to yourself, you can be sure that you've lost the scent. I have a problem with this, because I can understand why Kelly, particularly in the context of when he was working and the way that people are understanding, say, the Freudian understanding of the ego and the unconscious and the like, I can understand why he would find these ideas problematic. That there is a sense of we are imposing or investing these ideas with an agency, an ability to influence us that is perhaps, you know, that is unreasonable and is leading us astray. But what worries me is that maybe by saying we will focus just on constructs, etc., we are losing something here. We're losing something about drive and emotion in particular that we need to bring back in. And in many ways, that's what I want to try and put across here. So again, from Warren, Kelly's making this notion that PCP is not intended to be just an intellectual or a cognitive theory, although very often perhaps the way that construct theory is used does seem to feel like it's about operating at the cognitive level. He's also saying that it's taken to apply to that which is commonly called emotional or affective, and to that which has to do with action or conation. So he's linking cognition, affect, and action together. And I just worry that maybe we are conflating too much here. One of the drivers for conflating them is because if you don't do that, there is a danger that people will read into things like emotion and action, their sort of their normal common sense folk psychology way of thinking about these things, let's say, rather than saying, actually, let's try and think of how we can understand the relationship between action, affection, affect, and the formation of, let's not call it just cognition, but the formation of meaning. So there's a danger to my mind that by conflating so much, we may be losing sight of something that we need to unpack to be able to unpack that box that Michael has pointed us towards. So, there are three things here about making sense, which the top three bullet points kind of tie into the three arrows pointing into that box that Michael had, rendering things meaningful through something like constructs, sensing and feeling through embodied in action from the radical constructivism, and something about making sense to others, with others, in relation to others, sociality. And just spinning those in a different way, and what I've already said, you know, on sort of the core grounding points, I would agree with most of what we've seen before, subject to the caveats that I've said about Kelly doing too much conflation, is, you know, meaning and perception cannot be separated. Meaning matters in a non-abstract way. It actually has to matter to an embodied entity. And therefore it is both embodied and contextualized. And there's something here that is in that space that we need to be trying to understand how it works. So what is reality? And if Merleau-Ponty is telling us we have to move away from thinking about a consciousness of a world out there to how something is happening in terms of our embodied action in the world, which is leading us to construct the sense that we are an observing subject of an objective world out there. And if that is the reality that we, you know, find ourselves living on a seeming to live in on a day-to-day basis, then you know, a definition might be reality is the meaning-laden, apparently material-filled world that we perceive ourselves to be in and of. So that instead of taking reality as something that's given, we say, well, it's something that's constructed by our lived experience in the world. How are we going to understand that? And I think that is, you know, again, the core question that we need to be asking if we want to start and work out how we can get close to starting to unpack what we need to be thinking about and how we need to be thinking about it in that space that Michael's pointing us towards. And so I would ask, and you see the way that Kelly has sort of collapsed cognition, affect, and action, three aspects into one, and therefore created, if you like, a sort of a monadic starting point for his psychology. I would ask, you know, should we understand reality or this formation of reality as monadic, dyadic, or triadic? In other words, what are the underlying conditions of possibility for the formation of reality? So that's a question that I've been thinking about somewhat recently. And part of it goes back to quantum theory, because in quantum theory, there are no things. There are no objects in quantum theory, which is quite interesting because actually what quantum theory then says is that actually the formation of objects is something to do with how we as human beings interacting in the world. There's a certain sort of architecture in the world which has a certain way of interacting with the world that recreate this sense of being an observing subject, a self, an identity, observing an objective world. And that whole thing is something that we have created by virtue of the architecture of being a human being with a neural apparatus and sensory apparatus in the world. Okay. So if reality is monadic, then basically it's a realm of no things. So there are no distinctions, there are no differences, there's no you, me, subject, self, no objects, etc. Okay? But that's not very useful because that's not the reality that we find ourselves living in. It may be what the quantum realm is like, but if we define reality like that, then reality is not a particularly useful concept for us starting to sort of unpack understanding of the nature of what it means to be human in the world. So instead, we need to think of reality as this thing that we've constructed. And so then the question is, well, is that reality a dyad or is it triadic? And one of the issues that I've always had with Kelly is the way that he thinks of it as a dyad. And when I say always, I've only been understanding Kelly for a few years, so and not really digging into it. So apologies if this is too much of a misreading of Kelly, but please, in the discussion at the end, help me to understand that. When I think of a dyadic understanding of reality, I don't get drawn to Kelly, I get drawn to Derrida. Because Derrida has a similar dyadic view. And if you think of Derrida, he's somewhere in that top right-hand box of Michael's diagram. And Derrida starts off with Saussure. And basically what Saussure is saying with his theory of linguistics, and it could equally be applied to any symbolic system. And if we think about what I've said about meaning and perception as being co-created, co-arising, there's no meaning without perception, there's no perception without meaning, then basically perception is symbolic. What Saussure is saying is signifiers in a symbolic system take on their meaning not by anything latently referential to a world outside, but by their relationship to the other signs, symbols in the system. So the meaning of symbol A is defined by its relationship to all the things in the system of symbolization which are not A. Okay, so A, the little blue circle there, is defined by where it sits in relation to not A, which is the network of all the other possible symbols that are out there that the symbol, the signifier A, sits in relation to. So the meaning of a word is defined by its relation to all the other words in the language and how they are interrelated. Now, there are two possibilities here when you take this dyadic approach. One is that A is fixed because not A is fixed. Not A defines everything that can be said. And therefore A has only one meaning that it can possibly adopt within that. Okay? Another option, and if that's the case, then that system can never change. It's immutable because everything within that system is locked down in relation to everything else. Okay? Or the other possibility is that there is undecidability, that there is something in that system that can never be specified, that is undecidable. And one way of thinking about this is that there is something in this system of meaning that is beyond meaning, that escapes the horizon of meaning. So undecidability is pointing to the idea that in order to define a meaning of something, there has to be something in the system of the meaning that is meaningless, which is not just a sort of, you can't define its meaning, it's actually entirely beyond the system of meaning, so that you can never fix any of the meanings. Therefore, all the meanings are, in a dyadic system, are to some extent open to question. And that needs to be the case if the system is going to be able to change. And actually, this is implicit in Kelly, because Kelly fundamentally, with all his dyads, is talking about the fact that, with his corollaries, and I've just listed them here, I won't go through them, but he's talking about the fact that you can choose different dyads, that people have different dyads, individuals have different dyads, that these, what the two different poles of these dyads are changes over time. So he has a very mobile, mutable, changeable understanding of what a dyadic construct is. Which by implication means that there must be undecidability in there, that these meanings are not totally fixed. Okay. And what Kelly's saying is that the way that these meanings are held by an individual is very closely related, or is very significant in how they understand who they are and how they understand the world that they live in. So he's basically saying that the way that the dyads are formed in an individual through their life experience, the meanings that they have for that individual, and remember, I'm arguing that meaning and perception go hand in hand as well. So the very reality that that individual is living in are closely related, you know, to the identity of that individual, the sense of self of that individual, and the particular way that they hold the tension in that meaning, which from a Derridean point of view would be saying it's closely related to how they manage the disruption that the undecidability can potentially cause for them. So that's the dyadic approach. Remember, my question was, is reality monadic, dyadic, or triadic? The problem with the dyadic approach, and I would argue with Kelly, is that it has no theory for how this system is stabilized. It just takes that stabilization for granted. So you have a disruptive presence of undecidability. Okay, the fact that there is no ultimate truth to reality, everything is undecidable, which means there is no ultimate truth to not just to meaning, but also to perception. Okay, which is, you know, if you push it too far, it takes you to the relativist, idealist, social constructionist position. The problem is that it has no mechanism by which it can actually stabilize or sediment or stop the dynamic disruptive influence that comes from undecidability. If you take that too far, you say, well, actually, then you get an anything goes idealism. You know, you rely on, or the linguistic term, you rely on language. Language tells you how to lock this system down. Now, my PhD was actually about the fact that I don't think language does that. We absorb language into our symbolics, but, you know, fundamentally, this system has to be locked down by individuals taking up certain understandings of reality. And I think that's where Kelly is, you know, Kelly is emphasizing the individuality of how someone takes up a system of meaning, personal constructs, rather than that these are just social constructs which are imposed onto the person. Okay. So we have a silence here in the dyadic approach about how it actually stabilizes itself. And that, to my mind, is when we come back to Michael's question, is this fundamental question about how do you achieve stabilization? Now, talking to Harry, I got into talking to Harry because we were talking about Peirce. What Peirce does is Peirce puts in the notion of the interpretant. He says it's a triadic system, and a key part of that triad is the interpretant, the person who is making sense, which is, if you like, the person who is creating this world of meaning and reality, meaning and perception that is their reality. So basically, you have to think about, in order to have a world of meaning, have a reality, you have to think about actually what's happening in the interpretant. You've got to come back to the psyche. You've got to understand how the psyche is working in forming the reality of that individual is carrying. I have recently started thinking in terms of mattering as a way to try and unpack this, and mattering has these two meanings of materiality, So something is present, it feels material, it's present to me as in my conception and my meaning, in a conception and perception. But the other side is it matters to me, that there is a cathectic investment in it, that there is something about, this is a matter of concern to me, okay? Which brings me back to, I don't see in Kelly, I don't hear him talking about what makes this a matter of concern. Now, as I say, I'm not an expert on Kelly, but when he says no emotion, or we collapse emotion and action and cognition together, I feel like maybe this is something's being silenced there. Kelly's triadic elicitation, Harry pointed out to me that this is probably familiar to a lot of you. He described it as how are cows and sheep similar to each other but different to oranges. And I was looking at this and I was thinking, but we need to be clear here that similar doesn't mean the same. Similar means like but different. That there are actually, there's not just that cows and sheep are different to oranges, but there is a difference between cows and sheep. And this is important when we come to think of a triad. In a triadic system, instead of having a dyad with two poles, what you have is three different elements, three different aspects, A, B, C. And for it to be a triadic system, A, B, and C must be incommensurable. Okay, you can't collapse C into A or C into B because then it would just collapse into a dyadic system. Okay, you can't unite A and B into something else because then you would have a dyadic system. So what this means is A, B, and C must all be incommensurable, and any relationship that you have between two of these items, between A and B, say, any relationship that you form can never be fully fixed. Because C, the third element of the triad, will always pose a question for the way that you have pinned down the relationship between A and B. Now, there's something really interesting here, because what this says is in a triadic system, you must have undecidability. Any relationship between two elements of that system must always be disrupted by the presence of the third thing there. So Percy's triadic, Kelly, cognition, action, and effect. Time and again, we see triadic behaviors coming in here. Now, I'm not going to be able to sort of answer this. I just feel that we need a triadic ontology sitting in that space that Michael is pointing us towards. Okay. In the dyad, the undecidability arises because there is not a fixed relationship between A and not A. And so therefore it arises from the failure of A and not A to form a closed system. But in theory, you could have a closed system there. In a triad, it is impossible ever to form a closed system for the reasons I've said about there must always be this undecidability arising from the incommensurability between the question that C will always pose the relationship between A and B. So the dyad is a structural model. The triad is a topological model. These two, the mug and the donut, structurally they're very different. You pointed out that I started life as an engineer, Harry. This sort of comes in here. Structurally, they're very different, but topologically they're identical. The hole in the middle of the donut is the same as the hole in the handle of the cup. The only thing that's happened is the whole sort of cup part of the cup is a deformation of the surface of the torus. Okay. So a dyad relies on structure to explain undecidability. A triad says undecidability is an essential condition of possibility of the triadic form. Okay. So a triad gives us a topology that has to have undecidability. A dyad gives us structure that possibly has undecidability. Now, I would argue that we need a triadic understanding of how this individual is forming this reality. And I remember I said that's the space that we want to be sitting in for this place that Michael is saying we need to be thinking about. I would say that we need a triadic ontology, a triadic topology in there. Okay. These, I think, are topological claims. Okay. The fundamental attribute of human being is to create meaning. These are some of the ones that I've talked about. The bottom one, the triad means, so a triad A, B, C, that means we have three presences, A, B, and C. These are all things that are present in the triad. Plus, we have this question that they pose between themselves, the undecidability, which is an absence, a place that can never be, that because it's triadic, a place that is brought into being in that topology, but can never be fixed, okay? So it is an absence that is made present. So actually, in a triadic arrangement, you have three presences plus the presence of an absence. And I would argue that in order to stabilize the contingency of the structure that the triad takes up, in order to stabilize the presences that are there, okay, what you have to do is you have to somehow obscure the presence of this absence that you can never get rid of. Okay, you have to occlude or obscure the presence of the absence. But this presence of absence is entirely beyond the horizon of meaning. It's undecidable. It's beyond constructs. It's beyond poles of a dyad. It's beyond any form of presence. Okay. So how is it stabilized? And this is where Lacan comes in. This is Lacan's Borromean knot. Because what Lacan says is that human beings, the psyche of the human being is organized around the presence of an absence, the objet, a lack. And that the stabilized, so we have a triad of presences, the real, symbolic, imaginary. Where they interact, you have jouissance. Jouissance is affect, is emotion. This is one of these things that Kelly has collapsed out into his monadic approach. And that emotion is key, that affective investment is key to holding not so much just at bay, but stabilizing the disruptive presence of lack, the objet. This is why I'm drawn to Lacan, because Lacan is the only understanding of the psyche or the human condition that I've seen which has a triadic form that has absence right at the center of it. Okay. Now, my suggestion here is that we need something like this to be sitting in the place that Michael has highlighted that we need to be taking our thinking. So when Kelly says, if you start thinking about these things, you know, bringing in things, learning, motivation, emotion, cognition, stimulus, response, etc., you've lost the scent of his argument. I find myself thinking, hang on, has Kelly lost the scent or never seen the scent of absence, the presence of absence? And very quickly, because I'll pick up on three things that have come up in the talks that we've had that really jumped out at me as pointing us towards this. When Michael, in his first talk, talked about the example of pushing that a woman over, how the constructs she used around abortion, when he finally pushed her to her limit, she came back, and I bet Michael can tell us if this is right, but I bet she was quite emotional when she said it. She came back and said, I cannot explain this to you in terms of constructs. I'm just telling you this is who I am. Now, it seems to me that there is emotion and occlusion of the undecidability going on there, not falling back on just constructs, and that somehow the emotionality can be just contained within the notion of dyadic constructs. We had a session with Hinkle, and I think it was construct rattling was the phrase that I picked up on there. Okay. When you rattle constructs, you are pushing people to get in a very uncomfortable place, anxious place about who they are, because you're getting close. I don't think you're getting close to some truth about something that's wrong with how they're holding their constructs. What you're doing is you're saying, you know what, your constructs are not enough here, and I'm pushing at the very place that you don't want me to push at, where you're actually hiding undecidability, what Lacan would call the objet. And then last week, I was in a breakout session where we were talking about when you are doing a session, I'm not a therapist, but when PCP therapists are doing a session with someone using construct theory, and it starts to slide beyond that into something that's closer to analysis, where you're getting much closer to transference and to anxieties. And I thought to myself, that feels to me like we are moving away from this is all about constructs into something that's a much more about an effective investment in how people occlude the undecidability that is fundamentally their sense of self, or that their sense of self is helping to hide. So I'm sorry, I sort of feel like I'll stop there, but I've been trying to, in a very quick way, to try and sort of run you through in a way that hopefully may be accessible, some of the sort of thinking and the motivation that drives me behind what I think should be, where we should be looking to unpack that space that Michael has pointed us towards in the first session.
Thanks very much, Peter.
Thank you.
I think we're going to break out into groups of, would it be 4 or 5, Jeanette?
I think Jeanette asked for a question toward the sense of absence when he collapses cognition, action, and emotion together.
So shall we?
We're recording.
Okay, welcome back, everybody.
Welcome.
Does anyone want to start a discussion rolling,
Can I start?
please?
Am I crazy?
Probably.
I don't think you're crazy.
Thank you,
Or
Michael.
if you are crazy, it's a crazy that's it's a constructive crazy.
I think you've really dug deep to get us questioning, and that's incredibly valuable. I mean, I don't actually think of what Kelly said as a conflation, though. You know, I wrote a paper called The Construct, in which I said that the great thing about the construct is that it links together so many things in our lives, and links together so many things in psychology, which is typically very fragmented, dividing things up into things like emotion and intelligence and all that. And that when we've got a live human being in front of us in therapy or in any encounter, we've got a holistic thing going on there, and we can come along and split it up in various ways. But out there, as it were, there's just one thing. Can you think of a construct without emotion being involved? I often say, well, mathematicians are working with pretty sort of abstract and apparently very humorless and emotionless things. But actually, when you look at the working mathematician, they're thrilled and they're scratching their heads and puzzled, and a whole range of emotions, I would say. And that's to do, or it's governed in my understanding of Kelly as being governed by the constructs that we're using at the time. And when we change those constructs and look at it through a different point of view, the whole emotional feel of things changes. But it's not like there's no emotion there. It's not like it's been kind of sucked out of our vision.
Yeah, I mean, as I understand him, I don't think Kelly ever said there wasn't such a thing as motivation, emotion, cognition, and so on. He was saying that his purposes in enunciating his theory, the existing theories of the time of motivation, cognition, and emotion were missing so much that they weren't terribly helpful. But he wasn't saying we don't have feelings and emotions. Of course not.
But I don't think I'd disagree with you. I think can I just share my screen again, actually, maybe?
Yeah.
Because there was one thing I jumped over at the end. Which was something that Harry had sent to me the other day. Kelly wished to avoid what he called push and pull theories that see the need to propel us as if we are otherwise static through such ideas as drive, stimulus, etc.
Mm.
He argued that we are already intrinsically motivated, that we are a form of motion. And I think that's entirely right. But then the question is, okay, well, how are we to understand how this intrinsically motivated form of motion works? What's going on there? Because if we want to push our understanding further, that's what we need to look at. So I think it's right that, there was this view that a more static view that then is motivated. I think now we're at the stage where what we have is a lot of views around process theory and the like, where people are motivated to form a motion, what have you, but they're not thinking, okay, well, if there's this motion, there's this mobility, how is it stabilized? So I would say, yes, let go of static. Yes, accept intrinsically motivated, but we need to theorize stabilization within that. And that to do that, maybe we need to start thinking about unpacking the difference between construct, action, emotion, or how these are interconnected or whatever, rather than just saying, well, constructs are cathetic, there is a cathetic investment in constructs. Yes, there is, but why? What's it doing? How's it working? And I think that is where Lacan is trying to tease this open. And part of the reason why Lacan is interesting is because he's triadic, but the other is because he's sticking absence and lack at the center, which says we have to think in terms of stabilization rather than in terms of stasis. That's...
When you use the word stabilization, do I relate to that as being that, my construing today is pretty similar to my construing tomorrow? Is it a personal thing? Is it a sociological thing? Are you talking about stabilization at the level of society being quite homeostatic, or am I getting that completely wrong?
Well, to my mind, I'll just stop the sharing. One of the problems with a lot of social theory is it sees the stabilization as happening at the level of society in some way, the level of organization, interaction. This is my beef with organization theory, where as being in a business school. But I think the stabilization ultimately has to come down to how individuals are taking up their own being in the world. That's where the reality is formed, in the individuals and in the individual living and being in the world. Yes, they're socialized, but what is the stabilization? It's in some ways it's to do with we had this discussion in our breakout room. It's to do with stabilization of neural activity, and the fact that this is iterable. It can, and that's a Derridean term, iterable. That from one day to the next, whatever, you can repeat this. Not unchangingly, but with a sort of a recognizable repeatability. So I think one of the problems in my area is people don't understand that organizations are stabilized by the ways that people take up their being in relation to the organization, the ways that they relate as their identity to the organization. And that brings us back towards the area that Kelly is talking about, I think.
Peter, may I bring you back to a question that you raised in your paper, which is that we need a triadic ontology down in that bottom quadrant of the breakout. Have you come across the work of the biosemiotics? It's a development further from Peirce, but it's all biologists who are using it. The work of Hoffmeyer or John Deely, Seebuck, Are you familiar at all with that?
No, I'm familiar with the term, but I've not looked at the work.
I think you'd find that really interesting because that is a triadic ontology, but coming from very much a biological, developmental. Another person really worth reading is Terence Deacon. You come across him? The symbolic person, the symbolic species.
The name is bell, but no, this is a field that I've not explored.
Yeah. May I just also mention one other thing, because Harry sent me your PhD, which I've sort of been dipping a little bit in and out of. And there's no doubt that I think you get the symptom, Lacan's symptom, to do a fair bit of heavy lifting in your thesis.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that apparently that term symptom is one of Lacan's homophones around Saint Thomas Aquinas.
Mm-hmm.
And he was reading a lot of Saint Thomas Aquinas around that time. And of course, Thomas Aquinas comes right to your question of perception and meaning. And he would say, meaning and perception are not the same. That there's a step between that. And there has to be an interpretation coming afterwards. And that's where semiotics again comes right in. It's the dynamic of what happens between perception, which is perception of things in the world, the brute and then meaning, which is something you do internally. So that's just interesting that Aquinas 1,000 years ago was struggling with exactly the issue you're speaking of there.
I think, I mean, one of the things about my PhD is that it takes you up to the Borromean knot, which is what I put on the slide here. I've become much more interested from sort of seminar 20, which is about 2 or 3 years before the Borromean knot, through to about 2 or 3 years after that. Lacan's thinking is shifting quite a lot, and he's particularly shifting away from focus on the symbolic to focus on jouissance and the relationship between jouissance and the body and materiality. So I would not write the PhD now the way that I did. I wrote that about 10 years ago. But what interests me is Lacan gets to this because he is constantly pushing against the way that his work is being taken up as if it is just about symbolics and language and the like. And he's saying, no, it's much more about embodiment, about jouissance and effective investment and what have you. And he shifts his meaning of the santome towards the end with this as well. And you see it, I mean, Merleau-Ponty also at a different time is also running up against the fact that the dualisms that we have in the way we understand the world are not useful for how he comes to think about perception. And Lacan's work as well, I think, has been picked up more by Miller, Jacques-Alain Miller subsequently, and pushed some of these ideas. So I think it's important to see this as a number of different people who are thinking. I mean, Foucault is another one who has to increasingly come to terms with the relationship between the body and desire, and he can't work out how to do it with his theory. These are all people, I think, who are pushing towards this place, the need to rethink the sort of the relationship between embodiment, the individual, the formation of the individual psyche, and the social, and how that relates to the sort of the formation of the experience of being in a material reality, and biosemiotics, you know, and being subject to observing a material reality or a seemingly material reality. And biosemiotics is certainly another area that, you know, I'll take a look at. But I think what interests me is not that one of these, you know, I wouldn't say Lacan is the right answer. He has an ontology or a topology, which I think is a fruitful one to work with. And I can see trends around a lot of thinkers which are all pushing against the same problem that I think Michael captures in his slide, where we need to we need to go in the future if we're going to move theory forward, move our understanding forward, and break down some disciplinary boundaries. So I don't think I'd make a bigger claim than that just at the moment.
Michael, did you want to?
I have to say, I found your talk really fascinating, really. And as I was listening to it, I kept having two reactions to it. The first reaction that I had was kind of a defensive one, where I kept imagining that I was Kelly or someone like him, and assimilating what you're saying. Oh, here's a way to. This is how we'd address that. This is how we'd address that. This is how. And I felt that I could do it for every criticism that you put forth. But on the other hand, I felt that the criticism that you were putting forth had merit in some way, and that you know, I wondered what it would be like for a Kellyan to what extent would Kelly's theory, or should Kelly's theory, be elaborated by addressing these critiques. So, for example, from what I could glean, I could be wrong. The split between subject and object, self and other, is one I think that you're dealing with. The question of psyche, is there more in there than the monadic approach? The nature of meaninglessness in relation to, again, I think that Kelly can address all these, but I also think that there's something there. For me, the construct, Kelly's notion of a construct, is fascinating in its holism and in its bringing together everything in a way that you know, psychology still can't do. On the other hand, the bringing it together runs the risk of obscuring. There's more than one way to be holistic. Is Kelly's theory doing it well in 2020? Can it still address those issues that you're raising? I'd like to see what people say about something like that.
I'd just like to say that I'm completely with you about that feeling that there's something here worth considering, and that's why Peter and I are still talking and still friends.
We may not be after this. I don't know how you've reacted to it, Harry.
No, I think I've said enough. Let's get some new voices in.
But just to respond to Michael's last point, the notion of the construct, the thing that I'm constantly coming back to, and we talked a little bit about this in the breakout group, is that I don't find it helpful to think of a construct as an opposition of two meanings. It's an expression of a single meaning. Good versus weak, if you're speaking of a student essay, is a different construct to good versus evil. And it's the two together, that monad, that expresses a particular difference. I mean, I wonder if Peter's got any thoughts on that one, because I do think there are misinterpretations, particularly among the grid bashers, and I'm one of them, of, you know, emergent poles and implicit poles that lurk under that difficulty.
I mean, responding to both what Michael and Devi have said, I think you look at Kelly, and Kelly is working in the context of the time that he's at, and so he's therefore resisting or pushing back at whatever is there, you know, in popularly accepted. It was exactly the same for Lacan. It was exactly the same for Peirce as well. So you have to read what they write within the context of what they saw as misapprehensions, misunderstandings at the time, which were popular misunderstandings that they were trying to push back against. And I can certainly see in Kelly that, you know, this stuff about no drive and what have you. Yeah, if, you know, the drive, the ego psychology, all this sort of stuff, you'd say, hang on, I don't like this. I want to push back against it. and the construct approach is effective at that. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be moving forward. And I would say that what we need to develop theory which we can then look back at the work of these people who have, the people whose shoulders, I'm not sure we're standing on them, whose shadows we're standing in almost, and say, how can we make sense of what they're saying, take what is there that's useful, rigorously useful, because it fits with this newly developing approach that we've got. Some of it needs to be retained, some of it needs to be recast because it looks different. Some of it you say, well, actually that might be part of the context of what they're working against. And you can very much see that when you get into Lacan, in terms of the Lacan in the 1960s versus the Lacan in the 1970s. I'm sure you can do exactly the same with Kelly. And, when you say, Devi, that, it's actually the monad is the two poles of the construct capture something, that actually, I think that's, I'm very comfortable with that idea, because what I hear there is that there is something in the relationship between these two, the strong, the weak, the good, the bad, positive, negative sides of the two poles, which is more than just what those poles are. And that, to my mind, is something about that feels to me like there's something here where it's working to help to occlude undecidability, which is, and you've got an effective investment in how I am holding this particular, the monad that is the two poles of the construct, which is telling you something about my own self, my identity, my psyche. And that says to me that, these two poles are doing some work to stabilize undecidability.
Do you know what, Peter? Absolutely, because there's a problem again for the grid bashers when we try and pyramid a construct downwards. We can ladder downwards. In other words, express the single meaning, the monadic meaning, more precisely in behavioral terms, let's say. Or we can do some pyramiding, which is to take the meaning of the implicit pole and the meaning of the emergent pole and express each of those distinct meanings as a new construct lower down. The distinction between laddering down and pyramiding. It seems to me that you could explore, you could get away from this monadic expression of a single meaning that a construct is, by decomposing it downwards, starting to pyramid downwards.
Yeah,
I wonder if that's helpful.
Well, potentially. I mean, the one I will very openly admit I don't know Kelly in detail, and I tried to be deliberately a little bit provocative in this talk because I wanted to get a reaction, and also to get the reaction to how I was reading Kelly. I find the notion of pyramiding up to a single overarching construct. I don't know, maybe you can answer this. If you look at this in how that sort of notion is taken up in political theory by people like Laclau and Mouffe, the idea is that as you get higher and higher, the thing that you come to at the top gets emptier and emptier. It becomes increasingly meaningless. In Lacan, you would say that you can never get to this ultimate truth at the top. What you get is, lots of different ways of sort of approximating it, and they're always in flux.
Yeah, when I mentioned pyramiding, I rather was thinking of the technique of decomposing the two poles of a construct downwards. Right.
Okay.
What I will say about, moving upwards, laddering upwards, is that it is an extremely meaningful, it's a procedure leading to extremely meaningful outcomes for the individual concerned, because it's exploring his or her values, his or her core constructs. So I think there may be a difference in the way in which
there is a difference here, because from a Lacanian point of view, it would be that I think that the closer you get to that, the more what you're doing is you're exposing the radical emptiness of their own self, and forcing them to confront the fact that, you know, this is who I am. Well, hang on, who am I? What am I? That sort of thing. And, you know, the fact that it is powerful in terms of, you know, getting people to reevaluate is, but also a painful place to take them, is because you're pushing them to see something that deep in their psyche, they're saying, I don't want to see that. Would be a sort of I think a Lacanian approach to it.
Well, there's one experience I always have when I'm laddering upwards with someone, and that is that one of the signs, one of the symbols that there isn't a further point, a useful further point to take the process to, is when the person says, well, of course, it's self-evident, it's obvious.
Absolutely. Of course, it's self-evident, it's common sense. And usually there's a bit of anger in there as well. How can you be so stupid as to ask me that question? That's, you know, that's defenses against being this emptiness being exposed, would be a Lacanian interpretation.
I'm not clinical, so I couldn't start talking about defenses.
No, but you know, that to my mind is it, you know, and I won't tell the story now, but this is actually why, and it was an incident like that, which is why I gave up being a management consultant and find myself being an academic now. But yeah, it's common sense. How can you be so stupid? Of course, these sorts of things are, to my mind, are real indicators. And, you know, that Michael's example of the woman talking about abortion as well, this is just who I am. You know, these are all these sorts of defenses against confronting the failure.
Why do you see that as empty, Peter?
Sorry, see it as?
I think Fortune was going to.
I wanted to ask a point of clarification with Michael, who gave the original example, just to make sure that I understand the context of the discussion. As I recall Michael's story, the woman's response was, I don't see how any mother, a person who has children, could accept abortion. It was a case in which, not that she had indecidability or any lack in her self-definition, rather she precisely defined herself as a mother, as a woman who cared for children or wanted children. So in fact, it seemed to me that Michael's story was exactly the opposite of this assertion, but I could be misremembering. I'm often wrong. And so I was hoping that Michael would clarify the position of the speaker as a woman.
Michael, you're muted.
Yes, thank you. I've just pulled up the transcript. What she says is, so she's talking about her friends who were all pushed to have an abortion. And then she said, so I just can't wrap my head around a woman who wants to have a child, willing to abort that child. That was the claim that she made in response to a question that I had asked her. The sense that I got from that was a dual sense of this is only my sense, a dual sense of responding to the question affirmatively, you know, with clarity about who she was, but also the inability to go beyond that. She was as Peter said, she was at the limit of her capacity to know, and that she couldn't entertain something beyond that. So there was both in I would say a sense of, yeah, I know who I am and I don't know who I am in this. Oh, no, that's not right. I know who I am and that's the limit of my capacity to know right now. Something like that.
So a limit of her capacity to know is, I guess, an epistemological problem. and not a psychological problem, right? She's discussing implicit in that the notion of a woman who wants children. Who is a woman who wants children? That's someone who is a mother. What was the construct that was a woman who wants children, and her inability to have empathy beyond that? So it didn't seem to me in your story that there was a lack of psyche or an undesirability about her identity, but rather that she struggled to find empathy. But thank you for clarifying that, Michael. I'm sorry.
Well, it's interesting because we do read that differently. And I mean, you know, I wasn't there at the time, so Michael's the one who can comment on it. But it seems to me that it's not just an epistemological one, it's about one's entire, you know, sense of being, I think. That it's like the of course it's common sense, it's just common sense to me. Of course, I can't see this. It's more like it's not about an inability to have knowledge of the world, it's about an inability to be in the world in a certain way, which I think is more than just an epistemological one. But I think what we're touching on here is perhaps where I'm arguing that I think there may be something in Kelly that needs to be unpacked, or to bring more of the psyche back in. But that's my view. Certainly from a Lacanian point of view, I'd say this is someone who is, this is one of their defenses against anxiety, it's common sense. This is just who I am. Of course, I can't go there, that sort of thing. It goes deeper than just, I can't understand this, even if that's what's said, in the moment. But that's my reading of it, which I accept is different to yours, Fortune.
Well, it would certainly seem to agree with Kelly's notion that there comes a point where you've identified core constructs which are so intimately connected with one's sense of self that any further more abstract elaboration isn't going to be very helpful.
Well, and this is where Lacan then starts to unpack at the level of the psyche, the ways that we bring in defenses against having to confront these things, which can be saying it's someone else's problem, or can be, I think. No, I won't. I was going to say something about Trump, but I won't. But I think in times of uncertainty, it's easier for people to try and latch on to the person who says that they can provide the simple solution than to have to move into the space which actually challenges their sense of self and how they fit into the world and how the world works. There's a reason why populism takes hold in times of uncertainty, not in times when everything seems to be going okay.
Well, Peter, is there an element of the straw man with Lacan there that he's so abstract and so theoretical, and then he elaborates this forever, and I mean, you're concerned with stabilization. Is like what would it be like if you just didn't bother about worrying about stabilization and just accepted the system does stabilize and seems to, except at critical points and critical situations? Where would that leave you?
Okay, so the motivation for me is, if you don't think about stabilization and how it happens, the formation of stability, then you can't think about how you change either. Because how do you destabilize and transform? That's my motivation. You don't have to agree with that, but that's my motivation. That you need to understand stabilization, or there is potentially benefit from understanding stabilization and the formation of order, because it can help you to think about how you transform order. Elsewhere, I teach a lot of business ethics and issues around the need for major social transformation in response to the big challenges that we're facing in the world. And one of the key things there is you can't just change the institutions and the technologies, you need to change the world views. Or when things have changed, the way that people understand the world and how they fit into the world would have changed. So this is a more of a psychic transformation that has to happen. And so I'm interested in sort of having a way of thinking about unpacking that. The argument about the triad is because I agree with you, Robert, that, you know, why Lacan? I think the argument about the triad is trying to make an argument to say, this is why Lacan, because, you know, if you can find someone else who has a triadic approach, which goes right to the core of the psyche, then fine, I'll look at it and think about it, you know, maybe biosemiotics, but there's not a lot out there, you know, that is putting that and undecidability at the center.
Can I just say the transitional constructs, just talking about change and stabilization, like the, you know, the threat, anxiety, hostility, aggression, and what's there's another one I can't remember right now. It's anyway, the transitional constructs, like they all talk about the prospect of uncertainty, the prospect of change, and implicit in that is how you work with those to create stabilization. So he does really cover it in that, I think, part of it anyway, in that he doesn't recommend you rushing in and you work with those constructs in a way that helps people unpack the fears and move into other spaces, or, you know, other ways of construing. So, and I just wanted to say that piece.
Yeah, and I don't think I'm saying, you know, there's inherently a problem with Kelly or whatever, or Kelly's got it wrong. I'm saying that I think there's maybe benefit in opening up this thinking in terms of more thinking about the psyche and the role of emotion in hiding undecidability. I'm not trying to diss Kelly here. I'm trying to sort of open up a conversation which might be a fruitful way forward. With, you know, it's not about saying Kelly's wrong. It's about maybe there's a different way of looking at this where we can then draw out of Kelly some very valuable insights that can help to inform this. The other one I would just add, Robert, is Lacan was always, he was a practicing psychoanalyst, so he was always developing his thinking in relation to his practice as a psychoanalyst. And he never talked about his work as a theory. He always talked about it as a teaching and evolving thinking, that he was very conscious that he was constantly trying to rework and by articulating stuff in a certain way, pushing up against the limit of where it didn't work anymore, and then saying, so now how do I need to re-articulate it in a different way?
He never discussed the client. He never mentioned the client. He never
No, that is
referred to a single piece of clinical work. So it's, as a clinician, it's hard to get into the mindset of what did this man think of when he was sitting down with people.
He did a bit in his role plays, in his fixed role studies. He did, you know, he gave a few self-characterizations and how he worked with those, and they were with clients.
No, sorry, Jane, I'm talking about Lacan.
Oh, sorry.
mm-hmm. No, Robert, I think you're right, Robert, there. Yeah, that's a good point. Mm-hmm.
I think we need to think about finishing, actually. We have gone a bit over time, and there's so many things to talk about. My main feeling is that we're starting, it's like two people talking different languages, and there's various terms that you use, Peter, that I don't actually use every day, and I only sort of know at second hand what they mean. But anyway, let's think about finishing off. Are there any sort of very pressing final comments that people want to make before we finish in a couple of minutes?
Sorry, from one Peter to another, I was going to ask you about that word psyche that you have used quite a lot, because I find myself nodding and then thinking, I don't know what that means, because it felt like something that you had interjected into the discussion as a given.
It's a shorthand to my mind, let's see, a shorthand for thinking about how people take up their being in relation to the world that they create.
Could it be the construct system?
Yes, as long as you're prepared to unpack the construct system, possibly, you know, and start to sort of open up the possibility that, you know, we need to be exploring the role of undecidability, effective investment, you know, sort of. It was that thing, you know, unpack the motivation side of it. That is the thing that I said in what you sent to me, Harry, was I said, yes, but how do we understand motivation and stabilization rather than static?
Yeah. Anyway, I think we need to stop, and I'm sure everybody would like to thank you very much, Peter, for a very stimulating session. We just one thing to mention.